There is a particular kind of friendship that the world never sees, not the kind that gets photographed at premieres, or mentioned in acceptance speeches, or described in the authorized biographies that appear after a person dies. The invisible kind, the kind that exists between people whose names would never appear in the same sentence in any publication, whose relationship has no category in the formal taxonomy of human connection, whose significance to each other is known only to themselves and possibly to one or two people who happened to witness something they were never meant to witness. Robin Williams had several of these friendships across the course of his life. He was, in the truest sense, a person who did not recognize the ordinary hierarchies that govern most human social interaction, who did not sort people into categories of worthy and unworthy of his full attention based on their celebrity or their usefulness or their proximity to the worlds of entertainment and fame. He paid attention to whoever was in front of him. He paid it without calculation, without performance, without any consideration of what it might return to him. But there was one friendship of this kind, one invisible, unrecorded, entirely private connection, that the people who knew about it have described as among the most characteristic things Robin Williams ever did. Not the most visible, not the most dramatic, the most characteristic, the most purely, accurately himself. It began on a morning in the spring of 1998 in Marin County, California, at a gap in a wooden fence on a residential street 2 blocks from Robin Williams' home. And what it became, over the 6 months that followed, tells you more about who Robin Williams actually was than any film he made, or any award he received, or any sold-out arena he ever performed in. This is the story of The Fence, of Robin Williams and a man named Walter Cronin, and of the thing that passed between them in a series of unscheduled, unpublicized, entirely ordinary mornings that neither of them would have described, if asked, as anything more than sitting with someone who needed sitting with. Robin Williams had won the Academy Award for Good Will Hunting in March of 1998. He had given a speech that people would remember for a long time. He had been, in front of 50 million people, exactly what the world had always known him to be: generous, funny, emotionally present, incandescent with a kind of aliveness that cameras loved. And then he went home. Not to a party, but home to Tiburon, to the house in Marin County, to the ordinary domestic texture of a life that existed outside and beneath the public one. He had for years a morning practice that was entirely his own, a walk through the neighborhood, early, usually before 7, in the particular quality of Northern California morning light. The walks were not for exercise, or not only. They were for the specific purpose of being unspectacular, of being a person in a neighborhood, moving through a morning, with no requirement to be anything in particular. He knew the neighborhood well. He knew which houses had dogs and which dogs were friendly. He knew the woman who walked her elderly mother every morning at 6:30. He knew the Korean family at the corner who sometimes left a pot of something simmering outside their door. And he knew, or had noticed without fully registering, the house 2 blocks east, the large white house set back from the street, with the wooden fence along its garden boundary and the rose bushes that someone tended with visible care, and the mailbox that was often full for days before anyone came to collect from it. Until the morning, in late April 1998, when he rounded the corner and saw, at the gap in the fence where the gate stood open, an old man sitting on the garden bench just inside the property line, looking at nothing in particular. Walter Cronin was 78 years old. He had lived in that house for 31 years, he and his wife Eleanor, who had died in February of 1998, 6 weeks before Robin Williams won the Academy Award. Eleanor Cronin had been a retired school teacher. She had taught 4th grade in Marin County for 27 years, which meant that she had taught, at various points, the children of people who now lived in the same neighborhood and who passed her house without knowing it was hers. She had been, by all accounts, a woman of considerable warmth and considerable humor and the particular brand of patience that comes from spending decades in rooms full of 9-year-olds. Walter Cronin had been a civil engineer. He had designed bridges, not famous bridges, not the kind that appear in photographs and travel guides, but the functional, practical, necessary bridges that allow water to cross roads and roads to cross water in the ordinary geography of civic life. He had retired at 68 and spent the decade after retirement in the garden with Eleanor, tending the rose bushes that were now tended only by him and somewhat less well. They had no children. They had nephews and nieces scattered across the country who called on birthdays and holidays. They had neighbors who were friendly in the way that California's suburban neighbors are friendly, a warmth that stopped at the property line. Eleanor's death had left Walter in a house that was too large for one person, in a silence that was too complete for a man who had spent 31 years in the particular, irreplaceable company of a specific other person. He had stopped cooking properly. He had stopped tending the roses with the same care. He had started sitting on the garden bench in the mornings because the house was harder to be in than the garden, and the garden was harder to be in than somewhere that had air moving through it, and the gap in the fence at least allowed him to see the street where occasionally people passed, and the world continued, despite everything. He was sitting in this position on the bench, looking at the street through the gap in the fence when Robin Williams rounded the corner on a Tuesday morning in late April 1998. Robin saw him. Walter did not immediately notice Robin. Robin Williams slowed his pace and then stopped at the gap in the fence, standing on the sidewalk. He said, "Good morning." Walter Cronin looked up. "Morning," he said. There was a pause. Robin looked at the garden, at the rose bushes, at the bench, at the large white house set back behind the bench. "Those roses are something," he said. Walter Cronin looked at the roses. "My wife planted them," he said. "I'm not keeping them as well as she did." Another pause. The kind of pause that contains a great deal of information, if the person on the other side of it is paying attention. Robin Williams was always paying attention. "I'm Robin," he said. "I live 2 blocks over." "Walter," the old man said. And that, by the account of the one person who witnessed this first exchange, a woman named Diane Pellegrino, who was walking her dog on the other side of the street, and who would not understand what she had witnessed until much later, was how it began. Robin did not make a production of it. He did not announce that he would return, did not suggest that they should have coffee sometime, did not perform the social ritual of friendship initiation that most people deploy when they intend to follow through, and that most people deploy equally when they do not. He simply said goodbye after a few more minutes of conversation and continued his walk. But he came back. The following Thursday, at approximately the same time, he rounded the corner and found Walter Cronin in the same position on the bench, looking at the street through the gap in the fence. Robin stopped at the gap. "Walter," he said. "Robin," Walter said, and Robin Williams opened the gate and went inside and sat down on the garden bench beside an old man he had spoken to once for 8 minutes, and they talked for 2 hours. What they talked about on that Thursday and on the Tuesdays and Thursdays and occasional Saturdays that followed across the spring and summer and into the autumn of 1998 is known only partially from Walter's account, given to his niece in letters that have been shared with the careful permission of the family, and from the account of Diane Pellegrino, who walked her dog on that street every morning and who came to understand, over the course of 6 months, what she was seeing. They talked about Eleanor. Walter talked about Eleanor the way a person talks about someone they have lost so recently that the past tense has not yet become natural, slipping between was and is, correcting himself. The grammatical confusion of fresh grief. Robin listened. He asked questions. He asked about specific things, what Eleanor had been like in the classroom, what she made for dinner on Sundays, what she thought was funny, what had made her angry. He did not ask these questions to fill silence or to be polite. He asked them because he wanted to know the specific person, not the general fact of loss. Walter talked about bridges. about the specific engineering challenges of the particular kind of bridge he had spent his career, designing the load calculations, the material choices, the way that a structure that appears simple from the outside conceals an enormous complexity of competing forces held in equilibrium. Robin listened to this with the focused, genuine curiosity he brought to everything he did not already know, asking follow-up questions that Walter later described to his niece as better questions than the engineers I worked with used to ask. Robin talked too. Not about the films, not about the career, not about the Academy Award that was sitting in his house 2 blocks away. He talked about Marin County, about what he loved about the light and the fog and the particular geography of a place that was simultaneously close to the city and utterly separate from it. He talked about walking about what he saw on his morning routes, the observations that accumulated into a kind of census of ordinary life. He talked, on one occasion, about his children, about the specific, terrifying, illuminating experience of being responsible for people who were entirely themselves and would not be managed or directed but only, at best, accompanied. Walter Cronin did not have children, but he listened to Robin talk about his with the attention of a man who understood, from 31 years of marriage and 2 decades of watching Eleanor with her students, that accompanying a person without managing them was the most demanding and the most valuable thing a human being could do for another. He never talked about being famous, Walter wrote to his niece. I mean never, not once. He talked about his neighborhood and his kids and the fog. He was just a man who came and sat in my garden. I knew who he was, of course, I knew who he was, but he never seemed to want me to know. He wanted to just be there. The visits continued through the summer. Robin adjusted his walking route to pass the fence on his scheduled mornings. On days when he was filming or traveling, he did not come. The visits were shaped by his schedule, which was itself shaped by the work that made the visits invisible. No one in Robin's professional life knew about Walter Cronin. No publicist, no manager, no journalist. The walks were his private time, and Walter was part of his private time, and the distinction between the public Robin Williams and the private one was maintained with the care that it required. Diane Pellegrino noticed, because she walked the same route every morning and human beings notice patterns. She noticed that Robin Williams stopped at the White House on Tuesdays and Thursdays with the regularity of a scheduled appointment that no one had scheduled. She noticed that he stayed for a long time. Sometimes she would complete her full walk and return to find him still at the fence, or inside the gate, or visible through the gap in conversation with the old man on the bench. She noticed that he carried nothing on these mornings, no phone, no coffee, nothing, and that when he arrived at the fence, his pace changed, slowing from the walk's momentum into something more deliberate, more arrived at. She did not speak to him. It was not that kind of neighborhood, and it was not that kind of morning, and she understood from what she was observing that the last thing the situation required was a third person who recognized Robin Williams. But she watched, and what she watched, she later described as the most ordinary, extraordinary thing I have ever seen. Just a man sitting with another man, every week, for months, because the other man needed someone to sit with him. In October 1998, Robin Williams left for an extended period of work that took him first to a film location and then to a series of international commitments that kept him away from Marin County for several weeks. He stopped at the fence before he left and told Walter he would be gone for a while. Walter nodded. "Come back when you can," Walter said. "I will," Robin said. He did come back in November and found Walter thinner and quieter. The autumn had been hard, in the way that first autumns, after a significant loss, are always hard. The anniversary of the beginning of Eleanor's illness, falling in the same weeks as the changing of the light and the arrival of the cold that makes a large house feel more empty than it does in summer. They sat together for 3 hours that November morning. Robin brought coffee from the place 2 streets over 2 cups, carried in a paper bag, an offering that Walter accepted with the specific gratitude of someone who has not had anyone bring them something in a long time. The visits continued through the winter, less frequent but not stopped. Robin's schedule in those months was demanding, but he found the mornings that were available, and he used them. By spring of 1999, Walter Cronin was doing somewhat better, not healed, not past it, but inhabiting his grief differently, the way people do when time has done what time does. The roses were better tended. The mailbox was less full. Robin Williams noticed these things. He mentioned them. "The garden looks better," he said, one morning in April 1999. "I've been keeping up with it," Walter said. "Eleanor would have something to say if I let it go completely." It was the first time Walter had spoken of Eleanor as a present influence rather than a past one. Robin Williams noted it in the way he noted everything, without making a production of it, without turning it into a moment. He simply received it and moved on, the way you do when someone gives you something they did not know they were giving. Walter Cronin died in the summer of 2001, at the age of 81. He died in the house he had lived in for 31 years, in the bedroom he had shared with Eleanor, which is the way he would have wanted it. His niece, Patricia Cronin, flew in from Chicago to handle the estate. She found the house as Walter had kept it orderly, cared for, the garden maintained. She found the letters Walter had written to her over the years, a habit of long correspondence that the family had always known about, and among them, a series of letters from the last 3 years of his life, in which Walter described, with considerable detail and evident pleasure, the visits from his neighbor. He had never named the neighbor in the letters. He referred to him only as the man from 2 blocks over and my Tuesday friend. It was Patricia Cronin, reading these letters in the summer of 2001, who began to suspect who the Tuesday friend might be, and it was the solicitor handling Walter's estate who confirmed it, delicately, after Patricia asked directly. Walter Cronin had left Robin Williams something in his will. Not a large thing, not a valuable thing, in any monetary sense. A small watercolor painting approximately 8 inches by 10 that Eleanor had painted in the late 1970s, before arthritis had made painting too painful. It depicted the view from the garden bench, the gap in the fence, the street beyond, the particular angle of afternoon light through the fence slats. Eleanor had painted it because she said it was her favorite view in the world, which Walter had always found both moving and slightly amusing, given that it was a view of a suburban street in Marin County. Walter had left it to Robin Williams because, the will stated simply, he was the person who sat in the place this painting shows, and I think Eleanor would have wanted him to have it. Robin Williams received the painting through the solicitor in late 2001. He had it framed a simple frame, nothing elaborate, and hung it in his home in Tiburon, in a room where he would see it regularly. He did not speak publicly about Walter Cronin. He did not mention the fence or the Tuesday mornings or the 6 months of coffee and bridges and roses and Eleanor in any interview, any profile, any of the public conversations he had about his life and work in the years between Walter's death and his own. The painting was still hanging in his home when he died in August 2014. Patricia Cronin learned about Robin Williams' death from the news, sitting in her apartment in Chicago. She thought about the letters about the section where Walter described the first morning, the gap in the fence, the man who stopped and said good morning and came back. She thought about the watercolor painting of the garden bench and the fence and the light, hanging somewhere in a house in Tiburon. She called a friend and told the story, the full story, for the first time. "What kind of person does that?" the friend asked. "What kind of person stops and comes back and keeps coming back for 6 months?" Patricia Cronin was quiet for a moment. "The kind that understands," she said, "that the most important thing you can do for another person is show up, not once, not because you planned to, but again and again. Because they need it and you noticed that they did and you decided that mattered more than whatever else you had going on." She paused. "My uncle called him his Tuesday friend, but Robin came on Thursdays too, and sometimes Saturdays. He just called him his Tuesday friend because that was the day they first talked properly. Walter was like that. He named things for their beginning. Diane Pellegrino still walks the same route in the mornings. The White House has new owners, now a young family, with a baby and a large, friendly dog who has opinions about the roses that Eleanor planted and Walter tended, and whoever came after them has continued tending in the way that a garden becomes, over decades, a kind of inheritance that passes through the property rather than with it. The fence is still there. The gap where the gate stands open is still there. On certain mornings, Diane says, when the light falls in the particular way that Northern California light falls in the spring, and the air is cool and the street is quiet, she still slows down as she passes the gap. Not because anything is there, because something was. Because for 6 months in 1998 and 1999, a man who had just won the most visible award in his profession used his private mornings to sit on a garden bench with an old man who had lost his wife and talk about Eleanor and bridges and fog and what it meant to keep the roses going when the person who planted them was gone. Because the most important friendship Robin Williams had in those months was one that no camera ever captured, that no publicist ever knew about, that no biographer would have thought to include in the official account of a famous life. Because Walter Cronin called him his Tuesday friend and left him a painting of a garden bench and a fence and the light coming through the slats, and Robin Williams hung it in a room where he would see it every day and kept it there until the end. Because showing up, again and again, for someone who needs it quietly, without announcement, without any claim on recognition or gratitude, is the most human thing a person can do. And Robin Williams did it. Every Tuesday and Thursday, and sometimes Saturday, for 6 months, because Walter Cronin needed sitting with, and Robin Williams noticed, and he decided that mattered.